magical fix, and there were still moments when I'd recoil from a stray touch, or he'd catch me glaring at him with lingering suspicion. But it was the first time in a long while that we tried to connect rather than avoid each other. Upon returning home, we resumed therapy, continuing the slow grind of rebuilding. Daniel kept his promise to be transparent, leaving his phone on the kitchen counter, offering me access to his schedule. Initially, I hated how small and paranoid I felt checking up on him, but Dr. Henderson reminded me that trust, once shattered, needed such reassurances to mend. Over time, I found myself looking less and less, relying on the sense that I would know if something was off through these difficult weeks. I kept thinking about the question that had haunted me from the beginning. Could I truly forgive him? Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't a single decision but a process. One day I might feel ready to move on, and the next, a memory would spark resentment all over again. But with each vulnerable conversation, each tear shed, and each honest apology he offered, I found the anger slowly losing its grip on my heart. One afternoon, Daniel came home early from work, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in his hand. They reminded me of the ones we had in our backyard garden when we first moved in, he explained, eyes hopeful. He handed them to me, and I inhaled their delicate scent, remembering the early days of our marriage, when small gestures like these were common. He pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, a letter in which he detailed every regret, every promise, every wish for a better future. I read it in private, tears sliding down my cheeks, feeling the raw pain of the betrayal but also the genuine desire to heal. I won't lie and say that everything was magically resolved. Even after months of therapy and heartfelt efforts, the memory of his affair lingered like a scar, visible and sometimes painful, but no longer bleeding. We learned to talk openly about our fears, to ask each other questions we'd once been too timid or indifferent to voice. We discovered new hobbies to share, vowing not to let routine dull our connection again. And I began to see that, while betrayal had nearly broken us, it also forced us to confront the cracks we'd been ignoring for years. Now, looking back, I can't say I'm grateful for what happened. No one wants their marriage tested by infidelity. But I can admit that it tore down walls that might otherwise have stood between us forever. In some ways, we found each other again, not as the naive newlyweds we once. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never expected a simple favor to unravel the truth about my marriage. At 61, I believed my world was stable, grounded in a love that had endured decades of laughter, sorrow, triumphs, and hardships. My husband, Daniel, and I had spent 35 years side by side, building a routine we both relied on. We had our morning coffee rituals, our late-night TV marathons, our unspoken rules and schedules that made up our daily life. I assumed this unchanging routine was a sign of stability. But one crisp autumn evening, everything I thought I knew shattered into pieces, and I was left questioning whether any of it had ever been real. It began so simply, so innocently, that if I hadn't known better, I would never have imagined it would lead to such a revelation. I was setting the dinner table, smoothing out the creases in a linen tablecloth that had been my grandmother's, when my phone rang. My best friend Claire was on the line, her tone uncharacteristically tense. "Anna," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need a huge favor. It's an emergency." My heart skipped a beat. Claire rarely asked for help, priding herself on self-sufficiency. She and I had been inseparable since college, forging a bond over late-night study sessions and countless cups of bad dorm coffee. I could count on one hand the number of times she had called me in distress, so I knew something serious must have happened. "Of course, Claire," I replied, setting down the napkin I'd been folding. "What's going on?" "My car broke down on my way home," she explained, a trace of frustration in her voice. "Can you pick me up from the office? I don't know who else to call right now." Without hesitation, I grabbed my coat and car keys. "I'm on my way," I assured her. Then I glanced at Daniel, who was sitting at his laptop in the living room, typing furiously. Over the past few years, he had become increasingly absorbed in his work, or so I believed. He rarely looked up from the screen unless I said his name multiple times. "Daniel," I called, "I have to go pick up Claire. Her car broke down." He barely acknowledged me, muttering something that sounded like a perfunctory "drive safe," before turning his attention back to his screen. I felt a pang of sadness, recalling the days when he would have jumped up to give me a kiss goodbye or offered to come along. But I forced a small smile and left the house as I steered my car through the quiet streets, lined with trees whose leaves were turning shades of amber and crimson. My mind wandered. Daniel and I had once been inseparable, too, much like Claire and me. In our early years of marriage, we shared everything. Dreams, regrets, daily anecdotes, silly jokes that would make us laugh until our stomachs hurt. But somewhere along the way, we fell into a pattern of distance that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started. Perhaps it was after Daniel's second promotion, when he became head of his department and spent more evenings at the office. Maybe it was around the time our daughter moved out for college, leaving us with a too quiet home. Or maybe it was even earlier, an unnoticed drift that came on so slowly that I missed its onset. When I arrived at Claire's office building, the sky had already darkened, and the street lamps cast golden pools of light on the sidewalk. She stood under one such lamp, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Her expression was a mix of relief and embarrassment as she climbed into the passenger seat of my car. "Thank you," she murmured, forcing a smile. "I hate to drag you out here so late." "Don't mention it," I assured her. "You know I'd do anything for you." She nodded, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I focused on navigating the streets, while Claire stared out the window. Her silence was unusual. She was normally the chatty one, always filling any lull with stories or random observations about life. Eventually, as we neared the exit that led to our quiet suburban neighborhood, she exhaled heavily. "Anna, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice tight. "I've been going back and forth on whether it's my place, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. It's eating me up inside." My stomach clenched with sudden apprehension. "Claire, you're scaring me. What is it?" She hesitated, fingers gripping the strap of her purse. "I saw Daniel." "Daniel?" I repeated, glancing at her. "At the office." She worked at a marketing firm downtown, nowhere near Daniel's own workplace. "No," she said quietly. "I saw him at the Green Willow Inn." My mind scrambled for an explanation. The Green Willow Inn was a charming bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, known for its elegant restaurant and cozy atmosphere. "Daniel told me he had a late meeting," I murmured, more to myself than to Claire. "He sometimes works with out-of-town clients. Maybe that's why he was there." Claire sighed. "He wasn't alone, Anna. He was with a woman. They were at a table in the far corner. And they were holding hands." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You must have been mistaken," I managed, though my voice wavered. Claire shook her head. "I wish I was. But I know what I saw. He was there last Thursday. I couldn't believe it either, so I didn't say anything at first. But I can't let you live in the dark." We drove the rest of the way in tense silence. I felt as if I had swallowed ice, my entire body chilled by the possibility that Daniel might be lying to me. Thursday nights. He had claimed late-night departmental meetings or urgent deadlines. Suddenly, his absences, which I'd always shrugged off, took on a more sinister implication. When I pulled into my driveway, Claire placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "I'm sorry. I hope there's a good explanation. Maybe it's not what it seems." I nodded absently, unable to find words to respond. She gave me a sympathetic look and stepped out of the car, heading home to her own place just a few houses down. I sat there, engine idling, for several minutes, trying to steady my breath. My home, once a haven of comfort, now looked unfamiliar under the porch light. Was Daniel inside, tapping away at his laptop, unaware that his secret was on the brink of being exposed? That night, I crawled into bed beside him. He mumbled a brief good night without looking up from a report he was reading. I stared at the ceiling, mind spinning with doubt and dread. Every little detail I had overlooked came flooding back. The new cologne he bought but rarely wore around me, the texts he would receive at odd hours, the times he said he was with coworkers but never offered more than a vague explanation. I clung to the hope that Claire was mistaken, or at least that the situation wasn't as damning as it seemed. But in my gut, fear and suspicion gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. The following Thursday arrived far too quickly. Determined to uncover the truth, I made up a lie of my own. I claimed my usual Thursday book club was meeting an hour earlier than normal. Daniel barely reacted when I left the house. He was preoccupied, rummaging through his briefcase for documents. I lingered in my car down the street, heart pounding as I waited for him to leave. Eventually he emerged, started his car, and drove off in the direction of downtown. I followed at a cautious distance, desperate not to lose him yet terrified of what I might discover. Sure enough, he took the highway exit that led to the Green Willow Inn. I pulled into a parking spot far enough away that he wouldn't notice my car. My chest felt tight as I watched him enter the building through the softly lit front door. Moments later I followed, stepping quietly into the lobby and staying out of sight behind a large potted fern. The restaurant area was partially visible from where I stood. I spotted Daniel sitting at a small table in a corner, beneath a hanging lantern that cast a soft, intimate glow. Then my heart lurched as I saw her. A woman with auburn hair, perhaps 10 or 15 years younger than me, approached the table with a warm smile. She slid into the seat across from Daniel. He reached for her hand in a gesture that made me feel physically ill. Bile rose in my throat. For a few seconds I could do nothing but stare. This was my husband, the father of my child, a man I had believed to be loyal and devoted. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned on my heel and hurried back to the parking lot, trying to swallow the tears burning my eyes. But as I reached for my car door, a voice cut through the stillness of the night. "Anna!" It was Daniel calling my name, and the fear in his tone mirrored the dread in my heart. I froze, my hand on the door handle, and slowly turned to face him. He stood a few paces away, shoulders tense, eyes wide with panic. The woman was behind him, lingering by the doorway, looking conflicted about whether to follow or remain hidden in the glow of the restaurant interior. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaky, as if he already knew the answer. I folded my arms protectively over my chest. "I should be asking you that," I shot back, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You told me you had a late meeting." Daniel opened his mouth but said nothing, his gaze flicking back toward the woman. Then, as though deciding there was no more point in lying, he let out a defeated sigh. "Anna, please, I can explain." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Oh, I'm sure you can. But first, tell me how long this has been going on. How many times have you lied to me so you could come here?" He grimaced, glancing down at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. In that silence I found my answer. The weight of betrayal settled over my shoulders like a cloak of lead. My breath came in ragged bursts, and I fought the urge to collapse. His silence was more damning than any words could have been. "So it was never about work," I said quietly, voice cracking. "All those nights, all those excuses, they were for her?" He nodded slowly, sorrow etched into his features. "I never meant to hurt you," he began, as if that absolved him of his guilt. "But you did," I replied, tears finally spilling over. "And now, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Daniel hesitated, then took a step toward me. "Anna, you have to believe me. I never wanted to destroy what we have. Things just got out of control." Out of control. The word stung, reminiscent of a teenager's excuse. "We built a life together, Daniel. You don't accidentally fall into an affair." A look of desperation flashed across his face. "I know," he whispered. "Please, Anna, can we talk about this?" "Not here." I swallowed hard, glancing at the woman who was now lingering near the restaurant entrance, watching us. My mind was spinning with 1,000 questions, but every time I tried to speak, a sob threatened to escape. Finally I managed to choke out, "Fine. But she's not coming with us." He shook his head. "Of course not." Let me just tell her." "Don't." I held up a hand. "I'm leaving. You can either come with me or you can stay with her. But make your choice right now." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a tremor of pain through me. Then he hurried back inside to speak to the woman. I didn't wait for him to return. In a flurry of adrenaline and heartbreak, I yanked open my car door, slammed it shut, and started the engine. Daniel ran into the parking lot just as I pulled away, but I didn't stop. A part of me wanted to see him scrambling, realizing the consequences of his lies. The shattered life he might be leaving behind. By the time I reached home, my tears had blurred my vision, and I nearly clipped the edge of the driveway. I stumbled out of the car and made it inside, where the ghostly stillness of the living room reminded me that everything I knew had changed in a single night. I sank onto the couch, hugging a throw pillow to my chest, as if it might anchor me. My mind spun with questions, accusations, and a deep ache that pulsed in my chest. I thought of calling Claire, but words failed me, and shame gnawed at my insides. I had to face Daniel alone when he finally returned. Minutes later or hours, I couldn't be sure. I was still on the couch trying to compose myself. He entered cautiously, like a thief sneaking into someone else's home. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence so thick I could almost taste it. "Anna," he said softly, voice laden with regret. I looked up at him, noting how tired he appeared. His hair, sprinkled with gray at the temples, was disheveled. His tie hung loose, and his face carried lines of worry I'd never seen before. For the first time in years, he looked less like a distant workaholic and more like a flawed, frightened man. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed. "Her name is Margaret. We met through a colleague at a conference last year." I clenched my jaw, an unspoken question burning in my mind. Why? Why her and not me? But I refused to let him see my desperation. "Tell me everything," I demanded. "I want the truth, no more lies." He sank into the armchair across from me, rubbing his forehead as though he could massage away his guilt. "It started innocently enough," he began, words tumbling out in a near monotone. "We talked about work, shared frustrations about our jobs, found common ground. I told her about you, about our life, about how sometimes I felt like we'd lost our spark. She said she understood. She was divorced, felt lonely. We started meeting occasionally for coffee. Then it escalated." His gaze flicked to mine, pleading, but I offered no sympathy. "Why didn't you talk to me?" I asked, voice cracking with betrayal. "All those nights you said nothing about being unhappy. You just drifted away." He sighed, blinking back tears of his own. "I didn't know how to talk to you anymore, Anna. Whenever I tried, it seemed like we were both distracted, locked into a routine. I felt like I couldn't reach you. So you found someone else to connect with," I said, bitterness dripping from my tone. "What was I then? A roommate? A ghost in my own home?" He winced. "Don't say that. I've always cared about you. I never meant for it to become an affair, but the guilt and secrecy, it just kept building. And yet you did nothing to stop it," I said flatly. "Until tonight when I caught you red-handed." He nodded, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "Anna, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make this right." Silence enveloped us, heavy with the weight of irreparable damage. My heart felt shredded, torn between the love I once had for this man and the betrayal that now defined him in my eyes. I thought of the day we married, standing at the altar, his hands shaking with nerves and excitement, as he promised to love and cherish me for the rest of our lives. The memory felt like a cruel mockery of the reality we now faced. "I need time," I said at last, rising from the couch on unsteady legs. "You can sleep in the guest room, or I will. But we can't pretend this is okay." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eventually he just nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly drowned by an ocean of betrayal. I fled upstairs, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger, sorrow, and a strange numbness. I barely slept that night, haunted by visions of Daniel and Margaret together, sipping wine at the Green Willow Inn, laughing over jokes I'd never heard. By morning I felt hollowed out, as though someone had scooped out my insides and left a brittle shell in their place. Daniel attempted to talk to me over breakfast, but I refused to engage, escaping into the safe distraction of daily chores. Laundry, dishes, even scrubbing the floors. Anything to avoid meeting his gaze. Finally, he left for work, muttering something about an important meeting, but I no longer knew what to believe. Was he truly working, or was he rushing to be with her again? The hours crept by, and eventually, I found myself in front of the phone, dialing Claire's number. My pride screamed at me not to tell her, but I needed a friend. I needed to break the suffocating silence. "Claire," I whispered when she picked up, my voice shaking. "You were right." She exhaled sharply. "Oh, Anna, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to be right. Are you okay?" "No," I admitted, tears streaming anew. "But I don't know what else to do." "I'll be there in 10, she promised, and the line went dead when Claire arrived. She enveloped me in a hug that nearly broke the dam of my composure. I led her to the kitchen table, and we sat amid the scent of freshly brewed coffee and unspoken heartbreak. Hesitantly, I recounted the events at the Green Willow Inn, my confrontation with Daniel, his pitiful explanations. "He says he didn't know how to talk to me," I said, voice trembling. But he had no problem talking to her. Claire's hands tightened around mine. "Some men run away from confrontation, Anna. They bury their heads in the sand until it's too late. But that doesn't excuse what he's done. Do I try to fix this, or do I walk away?" I asked, hating how lost I sounded. 35 years is a long time to throw away, but he's broken my trust so completely. She pressed her lips together. "Only you can decide that. But whatever you choose, I'll be here." Over the next few days, Daniel hovered around the house like a remorseful ghost, offering to help with small tasks, asking if I needed anything. His presence grated on my nerves, and yet the house felt strangely empty whenever he left. Each evening, we danced around the topic of his affair, neither of us brave enough to open that wound again. But on the third night, I caught him staring at me from across the living room. Something in his expression cracked the fragile truce we had established. "What?" I snapped, turning off the TV. "If you have something to say, just say it." He cleared his throat, clearly uncertain how to begin. "We can't keep living like this. Maybe we should get professional help." I blinked, taken aback. "Therapy? You want us to see a counselor?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, if you'll let me. I don't want to lose you, Anna." Anger flared in me, a stark reminder of the rawness of my wounds. "Didn't you consider that before you cheated?" He bowed his head. "I wish I had. But I'm here now, and I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Part of me wanted to refuse outright, to deliver a final, scathing condemnation. But another part of me recalled the decades we had spent together, the love we had once shared. With a heavy sigh, I conceded. "Fine. But don't expect miracles." The next week, we found ourselves sitting in a therapist's office, a quiet space filled with tasteful art and plush chairs. Dr. Henderson, a calm and empathetic woman in her 50s, introduced herself and asked us to explain what had brought us there. I stared at the floor, letting Daniel speak first. He stumbled through an admission of guilt, tears choking his voice. I heard the rawness of his regret, and for a moment, a pang of empathy twisted my heart. But then I remembered the sight of him holding another woman's hand, and my resolve hardened. Dr. Henderson guided us through a series of questions. How had we let our communication break down? What were our needs, our resentments, our unspoken assumptions about each other? At first, it felt excruciating to air our grievances in front of a stranger, but slowly, I realized we had neglected these conversations for years. Daniel admitted that he felt pressured to be the perfect provider, that he felt overshadowed by my closeness with Claire and believed I didn't need him anymore. I confessed that I felt taken for granted, invisible, overshadowed by his constant workload. The more we spoke, the more I recognized how the seeds of betrayal had been sown in the silent garden of our own complacency. Yet, no matter how many therapy sessions we attended, I couldn't erase the memory of that night. I couldn't stop picturing Margaret in the glow of the Green Willow Inn's lantern, her hand in Daniel's. The betrayal had sunk its claws into my heart, and I struggled to forgive. Dr. Henderson warned us that healing would be a long process, one that required honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to accept that our marriage would never be the same again. She asked me to consider whether I truly wanted to rebuild or if I was just going through the motions out of fear of change. I didn't have an immediate answer. All I knew was that I felt torn between the ghost of what we had been and the uncertain reality of who we had become. Despite my confusion, life marched on. Household chores, bills, errands, the mundane tasks that made up our day-to-day existence continued unabated. Daniel tried to prove his dedication by doing the grocery runs, cooking dinner sometimes, and leaving me small notes of appreciation. But every so often I would catch a glimpse of his phone lighting up with a notification, and my stomach would lurch, afraid it might be her. One afternoon, I finally mustered the courage to ask him the question that had haunted me since the confrontation. "Have you spoken to Margaret?" He looked up from the vegetables he was chopping for dinner, sorrow in his eyes. "I sent her a message telling her it was over, that I was going to fight for my marriage. She hasn't contacted me since." I studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "You're sure she's out of your life?" He put down the knife, stepping closer to me. "Yes, Anna. I'm done with that chapter. I promise." I nodded, acknowledging his words, but a small part of me couldn't let go of the fear that she might resurface, that he might be tempted again. Dr. Henderson had warned me that building trust would require time and consistent honesty. But trust, once broken, is not easily mended. One day, while cleaning out the nightstand, I found an old photo of us from our first anniversary. We looked so young, faces brimming with hope. I wondered if we could ever get that spark back, or if the betrayal had permanently extinguished it. In the midst of my turmoil, Claire remained my steadfast friend, though I sometimes sensed her guilt for being the bearer of bad news. She confided in me that she, too, had once been tempted to stray in her own relationship, but had realized how quickly a moment's indiscretion could ruin a lifetime of trust. Her vulnerability made me see that I wasn't the only one struggling with the complexities of marriage. She reminded me that people are inherently flawed, and sometimes, the ones we love the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. As the therapy sessions continued, Dr. Henderson encouraged Daniel and me to go on a small trip together. A weekend getaway to see if we could rediscover any closeness without the constant reminder of routine. Tentatively, we agreed to rent a cabin by a peaceful lake, far from the reminders of daily life. I packed my suitcase with a sense of dread mingled with a flicker of hope. Could distance from our usual surroundings help us reconnect, or would it only highlight the chasm between us? The cabin was a rustic place nestled among tall pines, overlooking a tranquil stretch of water that shimmered in the afternoon light. It was supposed to be romantic, but every time Daniel tried to put an arm around my shoulders, I stiffened, haunted by the memory of that other woman. He seemed to sense my discomfort and withdrew into himself, leaving us both feeling awkward and uncertain. One evening, we ventured onto the small porch that faced the lake, nursing cups of tea in the silence of dusk. The sky streaked with purples and oranges, and a gentle breeze rustled the pine needles. "Do you remember our honeymoon?" he asked suddenly, voice subdued. "We rented that tiny cabin near the ocean and lived on grilled fish for 3 days." A faint smile touched my lips. "Yes, you insisted on fishing every morning, even though you had no idea what you were doing. You nearly fell off the boat." A soft chuckle escaped him. "I was trying to impress you." "You did," I admitted, feeling a whisper of fondness for that memory. Back then, everything felt possible. He shifted his gaze from the water to me. "Anna, I know I can't erase what I did. But I want you to know that I'm willing to spend the rest of my life making amends. I see you now in a way I should have before. I see how much you gave of yourself, how much of our marriage you carried, and I took it all for granted." Tears pricked my eyes. "Words are easy, Daniel. How do I know you won't slip back into old habits?" "You don't," he said, voice heavy with regret. "All I can offer is my honesty from this point on, and my commitment to do better." I'm prepared to show you every text, every email, if that's what you need to feel safe again. A lump formed in my throat. I appreciated his sincerity, yet a part of me refused to trust his words blindly. Still, the fact that he was willing to open his life fully to me was a step forward. The rest of the weekend passed in a series of small reconciliations, cooking meals together, going for quiet walks, sharing stories of our youth. It wasn't a whir, but as two flawed individuals choosing to love each other despite everything we'd been through. There are still moments when a stray comment or a reminder of that night at the Green Willow Inn sends a jolt of hurt through me. But Daniel has become more attuned to my emotions, apologizing sincerely whenever old wounds resurface, reassuring me with consistency rather than mere words.